Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about being caught in a difficult season of life, there's an expectation of visibility.
Right, like you want people to see the problem.
Yeah, well, think about an injury. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen.
It's very objective.
It is. The doctor points at it and says, there it is. That is the problem. It is binary. Broken or not broken. It is clean.
Hmm.
And it is comforting in a strange way.
Because you know what you are dealing with.
Yeah. We like things to be visible, to be easily categorized, to have a clear beginning and a clear end. You get a cast, people sign it, and you heal.
But life isn't always a broken arm.
No, it really isn't.
Yeah.
Because then you step into the reality of facing unjust circumstances, like sitting in a literal or metaphorical cell where no one can see you, and suddenly that x-ray machine is broken. We are looking at a landscape of human suffering that is incredibly murky.
It gets very dark, very fast.
It does. So for today's deep dive, we have pulled together a massive stack of historical research, linguistic studies of ancient Hebrew, and classic theological texts to unpack one staggering moment in Scripture.
Yeah, we are looking at Genesis 40, verses 9 through 15.
Right. We are going to examine a moment in the life of Joseph, a man locked away in an Egyptian royal dungeon, to understand how the sovereign Lord orchestrates human history through suffering, through agonizing delay, and through human memory.
And this is so relevant today.
It is. Because for you listening right now, perhaps you are painting a picture in your own mind of feeling forgotten by the world. Or, you are facing circumstances that feel entirely unjust.
Yeah, a lot of people feel like they're sitting in the dark right now.
So true. And this discussion will offer you a shortcut to understanding the historical, linguistic, and theological gravity of this text. We want to show you that even in the darkest pit, God's providence is absolute. The darkness does not obscure his vision, and the locked doors do not restrict his reach.
The sheer agonizing reality of Joseph's situation is really where we have to start. We have to set the scene accurately here, stripping away any sanitized Sunday school flannel graph images we might hold in our minds.
Yeah, we tend to sanitize these stories quite a bit.
We do. But think about who Joseph is. He is a Hebrew youth. He is a child of the covenant, the favored son of Jacob, possessing the promises of God. Yet where do we find him? He is rotting in a suffocating royal prison in a foreign land.
It's just a brutal contrast.
It really is. Right. To ground this in a modern reality for you, we can look at data from our sources regarding the National Registry of Exonerations. Modern men and women lose tens of thousands of collective years to wrongful convictions in the United States alone.
Tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, it's staggering. They sit in small, dark cells, stripped of their youth, their dignity, and their freedom, completely forgotten by society. And the secular world views this kind of suffering as blind fate.
Just bad luck, basically.
Just terrible luck. They see it as the cold, uncaring machinery of human institutions crushing the innocent. It is a worldview of chaotic despair. But we must contrast this secular despair with the Reformed view of absolute providence.
Right, which brings it a totally different framework.
It does. Our theological sources point to the concept articulated in Chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession. God upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all creatures, actions, and things from the greatest even to the least.
From the greatest to the least.
Precisely. The prison doors in Egypt were locked from the outside by human guards, but God holds the master key to the cell. He is superintending every heartbeat, every breath, and every nocturnal dream within those stone walls.
Which really pushes against some other theological views.
It comprehensively refutes Arminian theology and open theism. Those views suggest that God reacts to human choices from a distance, watching the tragedy unfold and trying to make the best of it. No. God's decree is exhaustive. He is not a spectator in the dungeon.
Okay, let's unpack this because the tension here is palpable. You are talking about a God who is governing every heartbeat and every locked door.
Yeah.
How does a person locked in a physical stone cell practically reconcile their perfect moral innocence with the reality that God placed them in that agonizing position?
That is the big question.
Right, because if I am Joseph and I know I ran away from sin, I know I honored God by refusing Potiphar's wife, and my immediate reward is a dark hole in the ground, my human instinct is to cry foul against the heavens.
It's a very natural reaction.
The disconnect between my righteous actions and my agonizing reality is massive. How does understanding absolute providence actually help the person sitting in the dark rather than just making them resentful of the God who put them there?
That is the crucial issue, and the answer requires a massive shift in our theological framework. Reconciling perfect moral innocence with agonizing circumstances forces us to understand that God's providence is holy, wise, sometimes severe, and always purposeful.
It's not just random cruelty.
No, but it's not sentimental either. Reconciling this tension practically means recognizing that our visible circumstances are not the ultimate barometer of God's favor. If we look at the historical realities of ancient Egypt, it adds incredible depth to the severity of this specific test.
Set the historical stage for us a bit more.
Sure, so we are looking at a narrative taking place around 1890 BC during the period of the Middle Kingdom, likely under the reign of the 12th dynasty.
Okay, very specific era.
Yeah, and the text specifically notes that this is the house of the captain of the guard. This was not a local jail for petty theft. It was a high-security facility reserved for political enemies of the state.
So high-stakes prisoners only.
Right. And into this terrifying environment, two officials are cast, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Now, the chief cupbearer in Hebrew, the Sar HaMashkim, was a massive political figure.
Because I think we often hear cupbearer and think of like a glorified waiter passing around drinks at a dinner party.
That is completely inaccurate. He was a trusted confidant, an advisor, and effectively a bodyguard who tasted the king's wine to prevent assassination. He had constant proximity to the absolute monarch of the known world.
So he was incredibly influential.
Highly influential. Falling from this height meant losing immense political clout and facing arbitrary execution. Furthermore, we have to grasp the Egyptian cultural obsession with divination.
Oh, right, the dreams.
Yes. Ancient Egypt possessed highly cataloged dream manuals, such as the hieratic dream papyrus from Deir el-Medina. They used magicians and priests to decode symbols through mechanical, superstitious processes.
Almost like an ancient science to them.
Very much so. Dreams were considered messages from the gods or the realm of the dead. The priests had massive lists. Like, if a man dreams of eating a crocodile, it means this. If he dreams of looking into a deep well, it means that. This highly regulated occultic environment is what Joseph is thrust into.
I have to offer some pushback on that specific point, though.
Sure, go ahead.
We have a culture swimming in occult practices, relying on magicians and catalog dream manuals to figure out what their false gods are saying. Why would God use a medium dreams that the pagans already idolized and built false religions around?
That's a great observation.
Because it almost seems like God is playing on their home turf, using their superstitious language. Could you elaborate on Joseph's monotheistic defiance here? How does Joseph claim that interpretation belongs to God alone, and how does that show the utter bankruptcy of all this Egyptian wisdom?
That is the grand irony here. It looks like God is playing by their rules, but it is actually a total hostile takeover of their theology. God uses the medium of the dream not to validate Egyptian occultism, but to bankrupt it entirely.
A hostile takeover. I like that.
Yeah. When the cupbearer and the baker have their dreams, their cultural instinct is to seek a professional diviner. They want a priest with a papyrus scroll, but they are cut off from the pagan religious apparatus because they are sitting in a dungeon.
The priests don't do house calls in the royal prison.
Well, they really don't. The machinery of Egyptian magic cannot reach them in the dark. Joseph steps into this void, but he absolutely refuses to act like an Egyptian magician. He does not ask for a papyrus scroll. He does not perform an incantation.
He just points straight to Yahweh.
Right. His monotheistic defiance rings out clearly. Do not interpretations belong to God? By bypassing the entire superstitious machinery of Egypt and delivering a flawless interpretation, Joseph proves that all human wisdom, all secular psychological frameworks, and all worldly prognostications are foolishness compared to the sovereign revelation of God.
He just totally undercuts their whole system.
Completely. He shows that the God of the Hebrews possesses the true knowledge of the future, exposing the idols of Egypt as dead and mute. And this brings us to the literary architecture of the narrative.
Right, the broader structure of Genesis.
Genesis 40 sits squarely within the Toledat, the historical generations of Jacob, spanning from Genesis 37 through 50. The author structures this narrative around a recurring motif of descent and ascent.
Descent and ascent, like a physical lowering and rising.
Yes, very literal in some cases. The Hebrew word bor means pit or dungeon. Joseph was violently thrown into a bor by his brothers in the land of Canaan, and now he finds himself sitting in a bor in Egypt.
Oh, wow. The same word is used for both pits.
It is. He moves from the treachery of his brothers to the injustice of a foreign empire. But this literary structure highlights an unbreakable chain of decrees. Look at the rigorous sovereign sequence.
Walk us through that sequence.
If Joseph is not sold into slavery, he does not meet Potiphar's wife. If he is not falsely accused by her, he does not get thrown into the royal prison. If he is not in that specific prison, he does not meet the chief cupbearer.
And it just keeps going.
Right. If he does not interpret the dream, he does not stand before Pharaoh 2 years later. If he does not stand before Pharaoh, Israel starves in the famine, the Lion of Judah perishes in the dust, and the Messiah is never born.
You know, as you lay out that sequence,
Mm-hmm.
um, it almost makes me think of a meticulously designed row of dominoes, or maybe the interlocking gears of a massive clock.
That's a really good analogy.
From the outside, a single gear turning in the dark seems completely pointless. It just grinds against the metal, going in circles, achieving nothing visible. But when you pull back and see the entire clockwork, you realize that one specific gear is turning that precise speed to move the hands on the face of the clock.
It has to turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does seeing this clockwork change how a believer views a seemingly random period of waiting in their own life? Because when you are in the waiting room or the cell or the hospital bed, you only see the one gear. You do not see the whole clock.
Seeing the clockwork changes everything because it destroys the illusion of random chance. When you understand that God ordains not only the grand ends of history, but also the minute, painful means to those ends, the waiting room ceases to be a place of meaningless torture.
It gives the pain a purpose.
Yes. It becomes the precise providential workshop of God. The grinding of that single gear is not wasted motion. It is necessary for the fulfillment of the divine decree. This brings us to examining the actual text of the vision and the verdict in Genesis 40, verses 9 through 13.
Let's get into the language there.
The linguistics of the cupbearer's dream are intensely revealing. The cupbearer sees a gifen, a vine, with serigim, 3 branches. And the Hebrew narrative here is breathtaking in its speed.
How so?
The text describes a miraculous acceleration of time. The vine is budding, its blossoms are shooting forth, and the clusters are ripening into grapes almost instantly. The verbal stems highlight a supernatural compression of the agricultural process.
It's like watching a time-lapse video.
That's a perfect modern equivalent. Then the cupbearer takes the grapes and squeezes them. The Hebrew verb is shachat into Pharaoh's cup, the kokos.
And the cup is a big deal in Scripture.
It is. In biblical theology, the cup is a massive symbol. It represents a measured portion of destiny, whether that is a cup of wrath or a cup of blessing. For the cupbearer, it represents the restoration of royal favor.
And Joseph doesn't hesitate with the meaning, does he?
Not at all. We see the absolute specificity of divine revelation. Joseph declares the 3 branches are 3 days. He does not offer a vague, generalized horoscope that could be interpreted a dozen different ways depending on the weather.
Like, you will meet a tall, dark stranger soon.
Right, none of that nonsense. He gives a precise, time-bound prophecy. It is not an educated guess. It is divine revelation.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, because the language Joseph uses is a brilliant, terrifying double entendre.
Oh, the lifting of the head.
Yes. Joseph says to the cupbearer, "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head." In Hebrew, the idiom is yisa et rosheka. Now, for the cupbearer, to lift up your head meant restoration to his office. It meant dignity, pardon, and returning to the king's presence.
Good news for him.
Very good news.
Yep.
But then, just a few verses later, Joseph uses the exact same Hebrew idiom to the chief baker. He says Pharaoh will lift up your head, but he adds the chilling phrase, "from off you."
Yeah, that addition changes everything.
It meant literal decapitation. Could you explain how the identical phrase carries such drastically different destinies? It is fascinating how the same ruler's attention brings life to one and death to another.
The linguistic brilliance of the text mirrors the nature of God's justice and mercy. The idiom yisa et rosheka demonstrates that proximity to the sovereign brings absolute resolution, but that resolution depends entirely on the sovereign's decree.
So the king's word is final, either way.
Yes. For one, the lifting of the head is grace and restoration. For the other, it is sheer, unmitigated judgment. The word of God operates in the same manner.
How does that connect to the broader biblical picture?
Well, as the Apostle Paul would later articulate, the gospel is a fragrance of life to life for those who are being saved, and a fragrance of death to death for those who are perishing. The identical truth brings distinct outcomes based on the sovereign purpose of God.
So the truth doesn't change, but the verdict does.
Right. Divine interpretation does not flatter the hearer. It distinguishes reality according to God's hidden counsel. And this leads us directly into the victim's plea in verses 14 and 15.
Where Joseph kind of shifts gears.
He does. After delivering the favorable interpretation, Joseph shifts his tone. The grammar marks this shift with the emphatic particle ki'im, which translates to only or but rather.
So he's drawing a sharp contrast.
Yes. Having spoken prophetic truth, Joseph makes a deeply human supplication. He asks the cupbearer for cheesed covenant loyalty, steadfast love, or faithful mercy.
He's basically saying, do me a solid, show me some kindness.
Right. He asks the cupbearer to show this cheesed by bringing him to Pharaoh's memory. And then Joseph issues an intense declaration of his own innocence.
And the Hebrew here is really strong, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly strong. The Hebrew construction he uses is gonafti, which utilizes an infinitive absolute to express violent intensity. In the Hebrew grammar, it is not just a polite, oh, I was taken.
It's more desperate than that.
It is a linguistic scream. He is saying, I was violently, wickedly ripped from the land of the Hebrews. Furthermore, he declares that he has done absolutely nothing in Egypt to warrant being thrown into the pit.
He's claiming total moral purity in this situation.
Yes. And this declaration is vital because it systematically dismantles the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel falsely claims that obedience guarantees earthly comfort and immediate vindication.
Right, the idea that if you are good, good things happen to you.
It claims that if you have enough faith, you will not suffer. But here is Joseph, morally pure, perfectly obedient, trusting God entirely, and yet he sits in a dungeon, suffering the crushing weight of systemic injustice.
So what does this all mean for us practically? You have Joseph demanding justice, stating his absolute innocence, and actively asking a human politician to get him out of jail.
Yeah, he takes action.
How does his demand for justice align with his trust in absolute providence? I think of it like a person in a small boat on a fast-moving river. They are paddling as hard as they can, actively working the oars to navigate the rocks. But at the same time, they know the current of the river is what is actually carrying them downstream.
That's a great visual.
Thanks. Trusting the current does not mean you pull the oars into the boat and just go to sleep. It seems like trusting God does not mean we stop using lawful means to seek justice or to improve our situation.
That analogy perfectly captures the Reformed understanding of secondary causes and human agency. We see that God ordains not only the ends, but also the means to those ends.
So God uses our paddling.
Yes, Joseph knows that God gave the dream and the interpretation, but he still asks the cupbearer to seek to Pharaoh. This is not a lapse in faith. It is the faithful use of available means.
It's practical theology.
Very much so. Trusting God's exhaustive sovereignty never produces fatalism or laziness. We are commanded to pray, to work, to seek justice, and to speak the truth about wrongdoing. Joseph does not pretend that evil is good.
He calls it like it is.
He does not sanctify injustice by keeping silent. He names kidnapping as kidnapping. Faith does not require denial of reality. The righteous may lament and appeal for relief, provided they do so without vengeance.
That distinction is so helpful.
And this framework is essential when we consider the original target audience of this text. Moses wrote Genesis for the Israelites who had just been delivered from Egyptian bondage and were currently wandering in the harsh wilderness of Sinai.
Right. They had just left Egypt.
These original hearers needed to understand why the family of Jacob ended up in Egypt in the first place, and how God could be faithful when his servants appeared abandoned. The narrative was specifically designed to shatter their lingering fear of man.
Because Egypt was basically the empire of the world back then.
Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world. Pharaoh was viewed as a living god. The Israelites needed to know that Yahweh was not a localized tribal deity restricted to the hills of Canaan.
He wasn't just a god of the mountains.
No, he controlled the highest officials of the Egyptian superpower. Furthermore, the text was a call to patient obedience. The Israelites in the wilderness were constantly grumbling about water, about meat, about the difficulty of the path.
You were not a very patient group.
Not at all. Moses is showing them that if Joseph, the chosen patriarchal instrument, had to suffer unjustly in a dungeon and wait for God's precise timing, then the Israelites needed to endure the wilderness without complaining against God.
I want to try a thought experiment for you listening right now. Imagine being an Israelite, standing in the dust of the Sinai wilderness. For 400 years, your entire family line has worshipped, or at least feared, Pharaoh as a living, breathing god.
4 centuries is a long time to be under that thumb.
It really is. You have seen the massive pyramids, the chariots, the absolute crushing authority of the Egyptian state. Then you hear this story for the first time.
It would be mind-blowing.
You hear that Yahweh, the invisible God of your fathers, casually reached into the highest echelons of Pharaoh's royal court, bypassed all the magicians, and manipulated the dreams of Pharaoh's inner circle just to position a Hebrew slave for a future conversation.
Just a casual manipulation of the empire.
Yeah. Could you elaborate on the psychological shock the Israelites would have felt, realizing their God manipulated the dreams of Pharaoh's inner circle? It must have completely broken their paradigm of who held actual authority in the world.
The psychological shock to the Israelites would have been seismic. It would have completely dismantled their internal hierarchy of authority. To realize that the God they were currently grumbling against in the desert was the same God who treated the Egyptian royal court like pieces on a chessboard would have produced a holy fear.
It totally reframes reality.
It taught them that true authority does not rest in chariots, monuments, or human dictators. It rests solely in the decree of the Lord. When God reveals that he governs the subconscious anxieties and nocturnal visions of the empire's elite, he is demonstrating that there is no fortress, no panic room, and no royal chamber immune to his will.
That is such a comforting yet terrifying thought.
This realization was intended to forge an unshakable confidence in the covenant community. If God can orchestrate the dreams of pagans to preserve the line of Judah, he can certainly provide water from a rock in the wilderness.
He's got it all handled.
He does. And this preservation of the line of Judah points us to the most glorious reality of the text, the redemptive shadow it casts. We must look at the true and better Joseph.
The Christological connections here are amazing.
The Christological fulfillment here is rigorous and staggering. Both Joseph and Jesus were beloved sons of their fathers. Both were hated by their brothers without cause. Both were stripped of their garments and sold for pieces of silver.
It's step for step.
Both were perfectly innocent of the charges brought against them, standing as righteous sufferers in the place of condemnation.
And the parallels do not stop there. You mentioned Joseph being in the pit, the boar, with the cupbearer and the baker. The historical parallel is staggering. Joseph stood in a prison between two guilty men.
Yes.
One of them receives a message of salvation and is saved. The other receives a message of judgment and is condemned. Fast forward to Calvary, and Christ hangs on a cross between two guilty thieves.
The exact same scenario.
One mocks him and is condemned. The other repents and is saved. And then there is the plea to be recalled. Joseph asks the restored cupbearer to keep him in his memory. Remember me when it is well with you.
But he fails.
He does. The cupbearer walks out of the prison, gets his job back, and completely forgets Joseph for 2 full, agonizing years. In striking contrast, the dying thief looks at the crucified king and makes the exact same plea. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
And Christ doesn't forget.
No. Christ grants him paradise that very day. The innocent man seeking to escape a prison relies on a human who forgets, while Jesus, the innocent God who willingly broke into the prison of human death, remembers the guilty and sets them free.
The failure of the human type highlights the perfection of the divine antitype. The cupbearer's amnesia is a tragic reality of human frailty. Prosperity dulls the memory. When comfort returns, gratitude fades.
We are so prone to forgetting once things are going well.
We are. But Christ, entering into his glory, does not suffer from human amnesia. He holds his people in everlasting remembrance. Furthermore, we must connect the cupbearer's wine to the ultimate cup.
Back to the symbol of the cup.
Yes. The cupbearer pressed grapes into Pharaoh's cup to secure his own earthly life. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ stared into the cup of God's unmitigated wrath against the sins of his people. He drank that cup of damnation down to its bitter dregs so that he could hand us the cup of salvation.
A completely different kind of cup.
Entirely. Joseph was exalted from the pit to the right hand of Pharaoh to preserve physical life during a famine. Christ was exalted from the pit of the grave to the right hand of the Father to secure eternal life for his elect.
That is just massive.
This Christological lens is vital when we address modern ideologies and apply theology to the world today. Impartially relaying the stance of our source material, we see how this text severely critiques both open theism and secular social justice frameworks, such as critical race theory.
Right, looking at how the text interacts with modern thought.
While systemic injustice is an undeniable historical and present reality, Joseph was an objective victim of a corrupt systemic dynamic. The biblical worldview insists that God's sovereign decree utilizes even wicked earthly structures to accomplish holy, redemptive ends.
So God is sovereign over the broken systems too.
Yes. God did not endorse Potiphar's wife or the Egyptian penal system, but he sovereignly wielded their wickedness to position Joseph. We also see the application of the law and the gospel to the conscience. The law exposes our human tendency to complain during minor inconveniences, quickly forgetting God's providence when the path gets difficult. But the gospel offers immense comfort, pointing us to a high priest who has engraved believers on the palms of his hands. He never forgets them, unlike earthly politicians or failing institutions.
I want to push back slightly on that practical application, though.
Let's hear it.
If we acknowledge that all human institutions, like the cupbearer, the political systems, the courts will eventually fail us, forget us, or operate with inherent corruption, how should you practically engage with the political or justice systems of your own country today?
It's a tricky balance.
Because if I know the cupbearer is going to forget me, do I still ask him to keep me in his memory? Do I still vote, advocate for legal reform, and speak out against false accusations knowing the system is broken? Or do I completely withdraw because my only true hope is in the high priest? It feels like walking a tightrope between complete apathy and putting too much trust in human government.
The answer is a resounding call to active, faithful engagement without idolatrous expectations. Joseph did not withdraw into fatalistic silence. He advocated for his own release.
He spoke up.
He stated the facts of his case clearly. He sought justice through the available human channels of his day. We are called to do the same. We advocate for righteous laws, we vote, we seek to reform corrupt systems, and we speak truth in the public square.
So we still do the work.
However, the crucial difference lies in where we anchor our hope. We engage the system, but we do not worship the system. We ask the cupbearer for help, but we do not despair when the cupbearer forgets because our souls are not tethered to the cupbearer's memory.
That makes a lot of sense.
We hold a robust theology of vocation, meaning we function as salt and light in the public sphere, fully aware that human justice will always be a flawed approximation of divine justice. We pursue earthly justice diligently, but we await heavenly justice patiently. This balance guards the believer against both cynical apathy and utopian disappointment.
That is a phenomenal distinction. Engaging the system without worshiping the system. We have covered a massive amount of ground today on Reformed thinking.
We really have. It's a dense passage.
To synthesize the main points, we have moved from the suffocating darkness of a pagan prison to the piercing clarity of divine revelation. We have seen how Genesis 40, verses 9 through 15, demonstrates God's absolute sovereignty over the dreams of the empire, the specific timing of prophecy, and the agonizing delay experienced by his righteous servant.
It's a masterclass in providence.
It really is. We have examined the linguistic weight of the Hebrew text, the historical reality of the Egyptian court, and the staggering typological pointers to Jesus Christ, the true and better Joseph who drank the cup of wrath to offer us the cup of salvation. All of this anchors the believer's hope not in the shifting sands of human memory, but in the exhaustive, meticulous providence of God.
Amen to that.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on everything we have discussed. We focus so much on the pain of the 2 years Joseph spent forgotten by the cupbearer. We think of it as dead time, a lot of wasted days. But consider this. What if that agonizing delay wasn't just about waiting for Pharaoh to have his specific dreams? What if the delay was the precise fiery kiln God used to forge Joseph's character, ensuring that when he finally held all the wealth and authority of the Egyptian empire in his hands, he wouldn't be destroyed by his own pride?
That is a profound, well, a very weighty thought.
Think about that the next time you feel stuck in the waiting room. Thank you for joining this deep dive on Reformed thinking.